as a table fruit. People don't think of using medlars as a table fruit or eating them like that. So that's the first and I think most obvious way that it's easy to eat them.
Hello, my name is Rhea Windcaller, and I am the producer and cider MC of this weekly podcast, where we speak with makers, cider enthusiasts, and folks within the cider trade from around the world.
Hip, hip, hooray!
Bringing us into this year, episode 383 of Cider Chat, you heard from Jane Steward, who is the Medlar Specialist. She wrote the world's first ever book featuring Medlars. And you might be scratching your head and saying, well, what do you mean? This is Cider Chat. What are you talking about? Medlars. Medlars are a palm fruit. They're a cousin of the apple, the pear, the quince. And she's got a lot of info to even share to kind of bring you up to date on this, what I consider a really super cute fruit. Wouldn't you agree?
Uh-huh. I love this episode.
Me too. Oh, and by the way, that's our own in-house talking palm, the Medlar, who is over the moon for this here episode. So, the talking palms love hearing anything that is really focused on their family. And that's the rosacea family, kind of like the rose family, but apples are part of that. All palm fruits, super exciting. And I know that now we're going to be seeing the Medlar for what it truly is.
And if I may, Rhea, I'd like to define what it truly is to be a very, very, etc., fine palm.
I couldn't agree more, Perry Pear. There's a lot of berries in there, aren't there?
Yes, indeed there are. And I also think that this is a good time to make a little snack, perhaps.
I'm on it, Perry Pear.
Very good.
I'm excited.
I know you are, and you should be. And by the way, let me introduce everybody. For new listeners of Cider Chat, I want to say welcome. And I am talking to the Talking Palms. We have Mr. Quince.
Hello.
And Perry Pear.
Yes, I am Perry Pear. Hello.
And the Medlars.
Hello.
Together, they make up the Talking Palms, who help me just about all the time in the back room in the Cider House at Cider Chat Central. And we're rolling out this episode. So we're going to be moving along because it's a pretty packed episode. I have some emails that have been coming in to me from all over the map. Some really nice connections out there in Ciderville. Thank you for telling me about wild foraging of apples in different regions of the world and some updates from the Netherlands. I'll be sharing that next week. And definitely people have been sending me emails all about the French Cider Tour for 2024. That is going to be rolling out to both Normandy and Brittany. It's going to be going live the beginning of this coming year to sign up for reservations, but that doesn't mean you should wait till then to let me know if you have interest for this tour, because there's only going to be a certain amount of people that can attend. And I have a really nice growing list of folks. We're going to have a blast. So make sure you send an email to info@ciderchat. Let us know how many people, and if you're interested to be putting on, be put on the early list, so to speak. All right, shall we roll out with our first sponsor for this here episode? That's the Northwest Cider Association. They have been featuring Idaho cider makers, the whole region, the agricultural flavor of Idaho. And just so you know, Idaho just isn't all about potatoes. They've got apples too. So what do you say, Medlars?
Roll it.
Idaho is fast emerging as a cider destination, and spearheading this renaissance are fresh, innovative makers like the Perez brothers Alex and Andrew. Check out their taproom located on the eastern border of southern Idaho.
The Perez cider brand is called High Point, and the taproom is located in Victor, Idaho, only a 40-minute drive from Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
And Drew and Alex didn't just happen upon cider making. They are originally from New Hampshire, where cider making was a family tradition. The brothers are living the dream, making cider with a tip of the glass to their roots and the outdoor lifestyle of both location.
At High Point, you will find 3 flagship ciders: Make sure to try their cider named The Transplant, a traditional semi-dry, modern New England-style cider.
High Point cider called Spur is also a 6% alcohol by volume like the Transplant. What set the Spur apart is that it is infused with ginger.
The Tramline cider features mosaic hops. At High Point, each cider showcases their dedication to innovation and unwavering commitment to quality.
If you're charting out your next cider adventure, make sure to stop in Victor. High Point is waiting for you.
And so are other Idaho makers like Cider Draw Cider just to the west in Beale. Meriwether Cider in Boise, Idaho will complete that leg of your southern Idaho trip.
Unearth the effervescence of Idaho's ciders and make the Gem State your next cidercation destination.
Find out about Idaho makers and more by going to the Northwest Cider Association website at nwcider.com.
This time of year, right now, where I live and where many listeners out there in Ciderville who are in the Northern Hemisphere, you are making cider, picking apples, pressing, or buying juice to try your hand at cider. And I do want to make a note that the last 2 episodes were all providing tips on how to make cider. The episode about 2 weeks ago was about the basics of doing a 1-gallon batch of cider for just about anybody who wants to try their hand at it before you kind of go full diving into cider making. And last week's episode was about keeping your equipment sparkling clean to get that really clean ferment. And one of the key things that you're going to need when making cider is yeast. And we have just a solution from our friends at Fermentis, who are experts in the art of fermentation. And they've been sponsors for quite a while on Cider Chat. So let's roll to this clip now, all about Fermentis and one of their 4 Sav cider yeasts specifically designed for cider making. Sweet, crisp, fresh, or balanced, whatever the cider you want to make, you will find the right yeast for your favorite cider in the Sav cider range by Fermentis. This week, let's discover Sav Cider AC4. AC4 stands for Apple Crisp. This yeast is ideal to produce fresh and crisp cider. It ensures a very good assimilation of fructose and is excellent for low-gravity ciders. The results are an intensely fresh aromatic profile, meaning apple and floral, with a crisp mouthfeel, enhancing cider structure. Sav Cider AC4 is the perfect fit for highly fresh and crisp, sweet, and dry ciders. Want to explore diversity of cider profiles? Discover it all through the selection of yeast strains by visiting their website, fermentis.com. Up next is our featured conversation with Jane Steward, the Medlar Specialist. We'll be discussing her new book titled Medlars, Growing and Cooking. Jane is based in Norfolk, England at Eastgate. Her business is called Eastgate Larder, and a larder is like a stock part of the kitchen. It's a little bit bigger than like a pantry, and it really fits to what she's doing these days with Medlars. She has an extensive orchard as part of the Plant Heritage National Collection since 2020. She'll talk a little bit about that, the varieties that she has, different cultivars of Medlars, and has a whole list of products that she's producing, such as Medlar jellies, chutney, and a Medlar gin liqueur. In the book, you will find a whole range of recipes, some of which we'll be speaking about in this conversation. So without further ado, I ask you to join with me to grab a glass and join this chat with Jane Steward of Eastgate Larder, discussing her book, Medlars, Growing and Cooking. We begin with Jane telling us a little bit about what a medlar is.
A medlar is a pome fruit, so it's a fleshy fruit with stones containing seeds. It's a close cousin of the pear, the apple, and the quince. And as all of those are, it's a member of the Rosaceae family. And it grows in the wild in bush form, but can be domesticated through grafting to produce a full-size tree, a half-standard tree, or a pot-sized tree, all depending on the rootstock that you choose.
And let's provide an overview of what medlar trees actually look like if you were to come upon one in a park or at a botanical garden or in an orchard?
Yes, at full size, and I'm talking here about a tree that may be on pear rootstock, you would typically expect the tree, when it's fully grown, to be broader than it is tall. The tree could be 15 to 20 feet high. I don't think they get much bigger than that. And wide, as I say, wider than they are high. If I think about my trees, I have a lot of them. And although I have a lot of space, I didn't want to have an orchard that ultimately would become so enormous. I have half standard trees as a result of choosing quince A and hawthorn rootstocks. Those trees will end up being anything from 10 to 15 feet high when they are fully grown. They will have almost like a lollipop shape. Think of those childhood round lollipops on a little wooden stick. And at a distance, they can look rather like that. It's also possible to have a multi-stem tree, which will also be on a hawthorn or a quince rootstock. It's all a question of preference in the end. But that is what they would look like. They are deciduous, but they are bare in this country really for only about 3 months. They finally lose their leaves in December, and they start to leaf up for the new season in the month of March. So they're very good value as a tree. They have beautiful bark. They have a very quirky growing form, much more so than their cousins, in my opinion. Quite usual to notice a lot of contorting in the branches, twists and turns to the point where you wonder whether the tree is truly happy. But actually, I think it helps to identify them when they are without leaves in the winter months. And the bark is very beautiful. It tends to be slightly paler and smoother than the bark of its cousins.
And how would you describe the taste of a medlar?
Well, its distinguishing feature is it's not huge. So even in the largest cultivars, I'm thinking there of the large Russian, which may be 2.5, possibly 3 inches across. You're not talking about a large fruit. There are some cultivars. There's a little stoneless or sans pépin cultivar, which is less than an inch all the way round. So really quite small, very easy to overlook. And that all the other cultivars will typically be within that size range. The most common medlar in this country is called the Nottingham, and that would have a diameter of about 1.5 inches, and it would be slightly flatter than that diameter. So it's got a very open calyx end. The colour at this time of year is beginning to become quite distinctive golden brown. The flesh on the inside, as the fruit is still hard, is cream coloured. And as the fruit ripens and softens by a process called bletting, the flesh of the fruit will darken and darken to become brown, which is probably one of the reasons why the medlar has become somewhat overlooked. Fruit, brown, and humans are not usually seen as being a good combination. We're very wary of brown fruit.
I feel like this is a little bit of a ridiculous question, but for those who don't know about medlars, why should we care about them?
We cared about them when we first discovered them, I believe, because they offered medicinal benefits. These days, in a world where we have managed through our human brilliance to reduce the number of varieties of so many different foods that we used to eat to a very short list, I think we should be caring about them because they add diversity to our gardens and to our digestion. They are good at dealing with a variable climate. They'll cope with very cold winters. They'll cope with very hot summers. They're beautiful if you're a gardener interested in beauty and ornamentation. They certainly tick that box, particularly their flowers in the month of May in the Northern Hemisphere and in the month of October in the Southern Hemisphere. Their flowers are regarded as being extremely attractive, and quite often it is these that bring them into people's gardens. The fruit has got real hidden benefits, and there's been a lot of research done recently in Central Europe by scientists who are keen to understand why medlars are still important. And they discover that there are potential modern medicinal benefits in the nutraceutical space.
Many listening to this episode right now have never seen nor tasted a medlar, so please describe the taste of a medlar.
Okay, well, it all depends who you are, but in broad terms, because we're all different, we all have a unique combination of taste buds as humans. However, the overarching flavor profile, I think, is a cross between a date and a ripe apple, with a definite hint of citrus towards the back of the mouth. Now, with it, that's quite a broad brush description. And cultivar by cultivar, you will find subtle differences. So one of my favourite medlars to eat as a fresh table fruit is the Iranian cultivar, available here in the UK. And that has a very beautiful, juicy flavour profile or texture, with such a gorgeous hint of, more than a hint of citrus at the end, that I think it's in a class of its own. And at the other end of the spectrum, I think of the large Dutch, which is a 2-inch medlar in diameter, which has got a sort of thicker texture, and to my mind has very little in the way of the citrus finish. But you'll have all sorts of things in between. There's a medlar called the Common Dutch, and that tastes very like honeydew melon, which doesn't seem to have any connection with either apples or citrus, but there we are.
Well, Jane, you have given some great descriptions here about the medlars, how they grow, where they, what they look like. I find them absolutely adorable, especially when they're on the tree and the little crown, the 5 little.
In England, we call them sepals.
Sepals, yeah.
Yeah.
I just find them absolutely delightful. So let's talk a little bit about. You mentioned they grow in a cold climate. They
do.
Yeah.
They do. Yeah, they'll grow in the Northern Hemisphere. They will grow in temperate zones 4 to 8, which I know is a way that in the US that you would look at the geography of your enormous country to think about what does and doesn't grow. And I had a lovely moment this week. I received a very long communication from somebody who wanted to tell me about the medieval garden that they had planted in Oklahoma.
Whoa,
exactly. I was so excited. And there, the temperature can be minus 23 in winter and 43 plus 43. This is centigrade in the summer. I know, it's astonishing, isn't it? And I know that they grow north of the national line into Canada. Anywhere really that vines seem to grow well, they will do well. They grow well up in Vermont. I was in America a couple of weeks ago and went up to Scott Farm on the Landmark Trust USA property there and admired their Breda giant medlars, which are thriving there. And in the UK, in Britain, they historically grew mainly in the southern part of the country, but I now hear of people growing them in Scotland. This is climate change in action. So when I was talking earlier about their resilience, this is something that we need to keep in mind all the time. We had a 50 degree centigrade temperature swing in the UK last year, 2022, and I didn't lose a single medlar tree. Some needed some emergency water in one particular part of the orchard, which has got super free draining soil underneath it, but I didn't lose a single tree. But if you think about where they originated, so we think, and we're going back now about 3,000 years, they are natives of the area between the Caspian Sea. So imagine the northwestern side of Iran, somewhere between there and the Black Sea, which borders the Crimea and then onwards towards Turkey. So we've got countries like Iran, Azerbaijan, and Turkey. And just to illustrate the difference between native understanding of medlars and, if you like, naturalized country understanding of medlars, in Turkey, several thousand tons of medlars are grown every year in Anatolia, and they find their way to market where they are consumed with gusto as a fresh table fruit. And the same is true, I understand, in Iran. They are regarded absolutely as a seasonal treat at this time of year. If you go across to Germany, Poland, France, Britain, this is a fruit which in the past had a real presence, but now is regarded something, it's really regarded as an unusual, quirky fruit, which doesn't fit with the modern Western food retail system. And this, I think, is one of, not the only, but one of the reasons why you just don't see them so often. And modern food retail, as we both know in our respective countries, is all about automation and standardization. And the medlar, I'm pleased to say, doesn't follow these rules. It's very much an individual. And if people want to enjoy them when they're ripe, they're definitely not going to survive the modern food retail system where they have to be able to bounce along a conveyor belt and get packaged up for sale. So in countries maybe where there is still a strong tradition, maybe hundreds of years old, around the joy of picking in the wild, going to market, waiting for the new season to start in any particular food category, the medlar still has a very prominent role to play in the diet of those countries, which I think is wonderful. And I would love to see the same happening here.
They kind of are following the same path of the apple, which came, from like the Kazakhstan, China,
Correct.
region. And we see that twins. So the pods start rolling our way for sure. And I want to say a little bit about Scott Farm. You had been there. I wish I could have attended that. Scott Farm,
it's a wonderful, it is a magical place.
Yes. Beautiful people there. And they have medlars. Before I planted my own medlars, I and I still go up there. I'll be getting some medlars from them when they come in. I know they got a little hit from the frost, but
not as bad as the apples. And they've suffered so badly, but they're doing well there. And I think they find that they do sell the fruit, I think, at the gate, and also I think they wholesale them through Myers.
Perhaps.
I don't know, but don't quote me on that.
and you said it's all Breda is the variety that they have?
They have, according to Erin, the orchardist, who is lovely, they have the Breda Giant cultivar, which is, I think, a very, very close relation of the Breda that I own here. I think my fruit is very slightly smaller than the average fruit size on the Breda Giant tree, but as we know, there are very strict rules and regulations about moving plant material around the globe. So I imagine that the original Breda Giant would have come into the US through some route. I don't know where or how, but it's lovely to see the trees that they've got there. They're beautiful.
That's wonderful. I saw recently on your Instagram, which I want to recommend everyone follows. I'll put a link.
Thank you.
You were talking about the Iranian variety.
Oh, Ria, this is just the most wonderful fruit. It's So, we have a big link back to a native homeland of the medlar in Iran.
Mhm.
There's a brilliant grower of fruit trees in the UK, down in the county of Kent. So that's down sort of southeast of London. And the family which established this nursery 40 plus years ago came as refugees from Iran at the time of the revolution in the late 1970s. And they brought somehow with them the expertise, or possibly even the plant material, and they cultivate the Iranian medlar. And there is huge demand for it in the UK among the diaspora from the Middle East.
Yeah.
And what's special about this medlar is that it has been bred to fully ripen or blet on the tree. So the process of ripening to a state of edible, fragrant softness is achieved by the fruit while it is on the tree. And these fruits are so special to me as a grower that I keep them completely separate from the rest of my harvest, and I reserve them strictly to eat as a table fruit. And we're able to do this all through the year because I discovered that medlars will respond really well to spending time in the deep freeze when they are in a state of perfect ripeness. So I get them to the point, I wait until they're perfect on the tree, then I pick them. And the ones I don't want to eat in that moment, I will lay on some wax paper on a roasting pan, sheet pan, I think you call it in America, pop them into the freezer like that. And when they're fully frozen, I'll then decant them into a Ziploc polythene bag. And then I have a stash of lovely Iranian medlars that I can eat whenever I want. But I promise you, there is nothing more magical than being able to stand out in the garden and pick a ripe medlar off its tree and just stand there and enjoy the juicy, appley sweetness with that lovely citrus spritz as I swallow it. It's magic.
Well, you have made me very, very jealous of that experience.
Well, come visit, and then you can have the same experience.
I will. Let's tell folks how do you eat it? Because there's a couple different ways to do that.
Okay, well, the medlar has, as a table fruit, people don't think of using medlars as a table fruit or eating them like that. So that's the first and I think most obvious way that it's easy to eat them. There is a very strong preserves making tradition in this country, and a lot of people will make something called medlar jelly, which is a really accessible thing to make in the sense that people understand what a fruit jelly is in a jar to eat with roasted meat, hot meat, charcuterie, cheese, maybe even just spread on toast. And we have a strong cultural liking for something sweet to go with something savory. Not every culture has this, but we do have that in this country. So medlar jelly is what I would call a very accessible way in for people who might not know what a medlar is, but have already got a taste for a fruit jelly, such as a crabapple jelly or a quince jelly or blackberry jelly, something like that they would naturally want to eat with something savory in contrast. But that's just the beginning of the story. You can use the pulp of the medlar fruit to make cakes, tarts. You can make something of a sort of fruit paste with it that you could then take down to a level of dehydration that ultimately becomes a fruit leather, or you could leave it semi-firm and keep it in a jar, or you could make it into something in between those two stages, which you could slice like a membrillo or the quince paste in a loaf form that a lot of people like to eat in the UK with a sharp sheep's milk cheese, for example. And there are other things you can do. You can use the pulp of the fruit to make a curd with maybe some eggs and some butter in it. And I discovered that medlar curd, when mixed with an equal quantity of heavy cream and with some salt added to it, makes a fantastic ice cream that does not need to be churned. So that is a lovely, lovely thing to have. If I don't want to make medlar jelly, but I have got some boiled medlars that I have strained to produce a beautiful tawny coloured juice, I can reduce that juice in a shallow pan over an hour or so to a thickness that would resemble runny honey. And that is a fantastic thing to keep in a jar in the refrigerator. It's lovely eaten with yogurt. It's lovely eaten on porridge. I use it as a substitute for honey in salad dressings. I will use it to naturally sweeten. You don't need to add sugar. Naturally sweeten roasted stone fruit, maybe peaches or plums, or quinces or apples if I want to roast them in the oven. And if I take the consistency down so that it really is quite thick, I can swirl it through some homemade or high quality vanilla ice cream, and you have a medlar ripple ice cream. So there are various different ways that you can use it. One of the winter highlights in this household is something called sticky medlar toffee pudding, which is the creation of a wonderful grower and cookery author, Mark Diacono, who's very well known in the UK and who kindly wrote a comment on the back of my book. And this recipe is fantastic. It's got a lovely caramel base to it, and it's a pudding that you bake in the oven, which has walnuts in it and muscovado sugar, lots of medlar pulp. And if you have any left over, you can put that in the freezer and have a midweek surprise pudding treat, which always makes my husband very happy if I happen to produce some of that. There are lots of things one can do. The other thing I should add, and this might be interesting for your audience of cider makers, is that the unbletted fully grown fruit, so the rock hard, tannin-rich, pectin-rich fruit, will also make some very interesting items that I only experienced last year for the first time as I was writing the book. You can make medlar pickles, you can make medlar vinegar, and you can also make medlar cider using the rock hard fruit. The sweet fruit has, I think, insufficient complexity to make for an interesting drink. You just get a hit of sweetness. But the unbletted fruit has some really interesting characteristics. And I've also made a preserve with that looks all the world like apricot jam. But you get a wonderful combination of astringency from the polyphenols and the tannins in the unbletted fruit, combined with some sweetness. And that is beautiful with some really soft cheese like a ricotta, or with some really thick Greek yogurt made with whole milk. It's a really interesting and a completely different way of enjoying the medlar.
Yeah, I read in your book, and I do want to say the book is so enjoyable to read.
Oh, thank you.
I mean, it's lovely. I've been, kind of squeezing it in here and there. Brings me off into just like I love your storytelling and how you bring us into a bit of your background, which we'll get into a little bit. But it was very, very well written. Highly, it should be in everyone's library. And
you're very kind. Thank you so much.
and I'm speaking truthfully. And you mentioned all these recipes. There is a whole bunch of recipes, such as the sticky toffee medlar you're mentioning. And so,
it's all in there. I have only mentioned things that I've included in the book.
Yes.
Yeah. It's important. If you want to revive a fruit like the medlar, I think one has to do it with your arm. You have to do it with your arms wide open. So I've put the recipes that I use in my business, and I have had, I think that's really important. And I also have been really lucky that other food writers that I know have been really happy for their own recipes to be included. That makes me so thrilled for the Medlar that others who've been championing the Medlar for a lot longer than I have want to be associated with this book, which is the first book on this subject anywhere in the world.
It's incredible.
It is astonishing, isn't it?
I know, it certainly is. I mean, I heard about Medlars from a winemaker based in California by the name of Randall Graham.
Mm-hmm.
And he told me about Bled the Medlar parties that used to take place in England.
Oh, really?
And I was looking for it in your book, and I didn't quite see mention. I could have, missed it, but
I've never heard of such a thing. I'm very sorry. I didn't know this chap before I wrote the book, because I would have liked to quiz him about this.
Well, I mean, I don't know what it's truly about. Now, having read your book, I thought you of all people based in the UK would know, but he talked about how during the Victorian era, and this is something I've been repeating, so I hope it's truthful. It was quite the delight of the different, the higher echelon of the society.
Yes. I know what you're talking about now. This is rather like apple tasting. But Medlars were a big part, really until the First World War came to an end in 1918 or the early 1920s. Medlars were an important part of the winter diet, and there would be, I can absolutely see that. And I have read about this. If I haven't made enough of it in the book or even mentioned it, of course, I apologize. But the fruit was, in certain places, it was celebrated. And the Epicurean George Saintsbury, who was writing in the very early 1920s, makes a really important point that of all the fruit in the world that you can think of, the Medlar is the one that goes best with wine. So you could imagine possibly a Victorian table, pre-1900, with, wine being passed around in a decanter, fruit of all kinds on the table, including dishes of Medlars if it was sometime between November and January, and possibly some cheese, I don't know. But yeah, I can absolutely see that.
Mm-hmm.
And we know, we have a big tradition of apple tasting. I mean, you have heirloom apple days in America. I know that, particularly in the Eastern Seaboard states. But we also have apple days here. But I think that this is something that I might make something of on Instagram this coming winter.
Lovely. The Medlar, it comes to ripen further on than a lot of the other fruits. So that must be a certain place for people.
Exactly. And that's coming back to one of your earlier questions. This was, from a dietary point of view, very important in those winter months. And if you had a good system for storing them without refrigeration, and some people had ice houses, on their properties, the wealthier people, I would imagine, there are ways and means of keeping the Medlars going, not all the way through to the spring necessarily, but certainly a good way into the winter. And while they wouldn't have, kept your tummy completely full, they would certainly have made sure that you got some vitamin C, some fiber, some sweetness, some pleasure into your diet in those months when maybe other fruits were not so widely available.
Yes, I agree. Yeah. And I know that you mentioned that Medlars go really well with wine, but I'd like to add that they go very well with a dry cider or a perry, which we know, in your country, it's kind of having a comeback. It's been there for a long time. The English are well known for their consumption of cider, but as cider has become more universally accepted as a craft that, like what you're doing with the Medlars, can be made into different forms where it's very sweet or very dry or tannin, and it is made like wine, I want to say try Medlars with cider or perry, and get a nice dry one to really allow the fruit to accentuate itself.
I think I can absolutely taste something wonderful now in my imagination, which is a beautiful dry cider or perry with some very well chosen artisan cheese, of which you have an enormous choice in America.
Yes, we do.
You do. I've been into Formaggio Kitchen in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I have admired their cheese counter with very green eyes. And then some Medlar on the side. I could see that absolutely making a most beautiful feast.
Let's talk a little bit about right now. We're talking October. They're on the trees. When are you going to be picking them?
The questions are beginning to flow in from various quarters. Based on the last 6 or 7 years since I started the business, it seems, regardless of the weather and regardless of when the flowers came, that the 4th week of October is the week that harvest usually needs to begin. And that seems to mark the time where the leaves really are beginning to change colour and the hard fruit is beginning to feel ready to loosen itself easily from the spurs on the trees, which usually hold them. And I test using a very complicated scientific method called shaking the tree. So if I shake the tree and medlars fall to the ground, I don't mean 1 or 2, but maybe 10 or 15, off a tree that might have a couple of hundred fruit on it, then I will think to myself, okay, I need to start picking. They don't happily all reach that stage at an identical moment. And I do have an orchard with now 115 trees in it. So it does take some time to get round all of them. But that's what I look for. So the picking or the harvesting window, this is true for the Northern Hemisphere, I think, as a whole, is roughly from the end of October. And it can go into the first week of December, particularly for one of the cultivars that I grow, and which I've seen elsewhere. And that's a cultivar called Westerveld. Westerveld, which happens to be a place in the Netherlands. That fruit definitely likes to be picked much later. And I know that in previous years when I've been hasty and picked them too early, the bletting is definitely tortuous. So it pays, as with so much to do with medlars, to be patient. If I can be patient, then I will get a better result by picking them towards the end of November rather than any sooner. And of course, for anybody listening, and I'm sure that there will be listeners in the Southern Hemisphere, harvest cues should start to appear from April onwards. Their trees are just beginning to come into flower, as I understand it. This is a global, in the temperate zone, of the equivalent temperate zones in the Southern Hemisphere. So Tasmania, the state of Victoria in Australia, and parts of New Zealand. This is a fruit that will grow really well down there.
Oh, that's a good tip. In terms of growing the medlars themselves, do you need to have 2 trees or can you just have 1?
You can just have 1. So they're perfect for the smallest plot. And if you have, for anybody listening in the UK, if you have a small, as so many of us do, courtyard or slightly bigger garden, you can now get something called a Sibley patio medlar, which is on quince sea rootstock, which would grow in a large pot and produce maybe between 40 and 60 fruits when it's about 5 years old. And the tree would stand about 1 meter, say 3 feet to 4 feet tall. That is definitely something worth considering.
Yeah.
But they are very easy to grow. They need neutral to slightly acid soil. They definitely do not like lime. 1 or 2 of mine, I think, have collided at the root level with some builder's rubble from old farm buildings that were demolished. And, the debris, as happens here, dug a big hole, in went the debris. And those trees are really shrieking at me at the moment with bright yellow leaves, not because they're ready to harvest, but because they've hit some lime in the mortar, which is quite classically used in this country. But they are typically very straightforward, Ria. They don't need complicated pruning. They don't need anything other than some water. Not too much, but some water while they're establishing themselves. The trick with a medlar is not to let them fruit too young. If they're happy, they will push out flowers and try and fruit from about their 3rd birthday onwards. I've had to hold back and be very disciplined and not let them do that really until their 4th to 5th birthday. And this year, my youngest trees, which are chronologically 6 years old, are really beginning to get into their stride, and will have some nice fruit. I put a picture up on Instagram today of my youngest large Dutch medlar with a second image showing, a healthy looking crop on not a very large tree at all. So, this is what we're dealing with. But they're delightfully undemanding, as I say. No, they are delightfully undemanding. We lead busy lives, all of us. And, gardening is a process, not something that ever comes to an end. So something like a medlar is great in terms of the diversity that it adds to the plot. But it's also delightful because it doesn't stand there saying, well, now you've got to do this and then you've got to do that. It just quietly gets on with doing what it wants to do.
I love it. One of the first medlar trees I ever saw was in Amsterdam in the Vondelpark. I was just riding my bike along, and in that beautiful park they have there was, I looked up and I was like, oh my goodness, a medlar tree. The Dutch are fantastic growers.
They are. They have a long heritage. You've probably noticed in the book a couple of stories relating back to medlar trees that were sourced from what was then called the Low Countries, by famous gardeners like Tradescant, sent across from by the Cecil family at Hatfield House to go and source medlars. I think he bought back a Naples and a Dutch. I think he paid a whole 5 shillings for each of them.
I have a Royal and a Breda, but you have, how many varieties do you have?
I've got a horticultural and culinary collection, the national collection, as defined by Plant Heritage, which is the world's largest plant conservation charity. And there are about 700 national collections here in the UK. And there are 10 that I should have in the collection. I've currently got 9, and next year I should take delivery of a pair of large Russian medlars, which will complete the picture. I managed to track down some cyan wood earlier this year, and Keeper's Nursery, who I mentioned earlier in connection with the Iranian medlar, the grower there has very kindly grafted this Russian cyan wood onto some quince rootstock for me, for which I'm enormously grateful. So I will have 10 cultivars, and the ones that I have included, it's complicated here because you've got a very sort of narrow genetic pool to choose among. And according to the Royal Horticultural Society plant list, which is a reference list for plant heritage collections, there is a listing of about 20 or 22 varieties or cultivars, but in fact a number of them are synonym varieties. So I went through this list and, in consultation with Plant Heritage, selected Nottingham Royal, Breda, Bredus Royce, Flanders Giant, Westerveld, Macrocarpa, Large Russian, Iranian, and one more that is Royal, I think, which is temporarily. Yeah, that makes 10. And so that is what I have. But you see, I also fell foul of the synonym trap early on when I was adding to the beginnings of the orchard, I came across a medlar called Elizabeth Garrett Anderson, who was a pioneering woman. Oh gosh, I suppose back in the 1800s or maybe the late 1700s. Anyway, she was one of the first women in the UK to train as a doctor. And somebody had obviously decided that a cultivar of medlar needed to be called after her. And I was so excited to find it. I bought it. And I still can't work out which cultivar it is, which is another problem with medlars, Ria. They're very difficult to identify facially in the way that we do with apples and pears. Some cultivars are easier to identify than others. I can spot an Iranian and a large Dutch and a large Russian and a Nottingham at a reasonable distance. But then there is there's a group: the Royal, the Westerfeld, the Macrocarpa, the Bredus Royce, which all look pretty well indistinguishable from each other. So I struggle. I'm quite open about this because, there's no need to have a secret about it. Anyway, one day when I make my fortune, I may be able to invest in some genetic profiling, but until then,
Just enjoy it.
I just enjoy them.
Yeah, that makes sense. Absolutely. Well, let's talk a little bit about your path to becoming a Medlar specialist, because it's just pretty unique. You have a lot of varieties where you are, but this wasn't something that you kind of, no one, well, now people hearing this will say, when I grow up, I want to become a Medlar specialist like Jane. But how did this come about for you?
Oh, gosh. Well, thank you for asking the question. Oh, gosh.
The journey.
It has been a journey. I don't know when I'd have collided with a medlar tree if I hadn't met my husband, David, in the autumn of 2008. That's the first thing. He had a lovely medlar tree in his garden, and he'd been given it by his dad in memory of his grandparents. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that when we moved here to Norfolk in 2012, we brought with us a baby medlar tree that we'd been given when we got married. And I wanted to bring that tree with us because, we were sentimentally attached to it after 2 years, and we didn't want to leave it behind. And we added to it because we wanted to have a pretty ornamental avenue of medlars in our new garden. And our kids helped us to plant them. We're optimistic second timers, I should add. We have 7 adult children between us. And the kids came and they helped plant these trees. And I thought that was sort of the beginning, the middle, and the end of it. But then in 2015, unexpectedly, I was diagnosed with bowel cancer as a result of a screening program operated at our local university hospital. It was a scheme that they had designed for research purposes. Was it worth screening people aged 55 for bowel cancer, which is it's the 4th most devastating cancer in the UK these days. A reflection probably of 2 things: diet and stress. Anyway, there we are. I was very fortunate because when I got the letter, I said yes. And along I went, and then they told me. And then, amazingly, this stage 1 cancer was curable. And they cured me. They did some surgery. I didn't need chemo or radiotherapy. But the shock of that, and I suppose if one remembers that the brain and the gut are one system, whilst I'd been cured, I was suffering a little bit from what might have beens and those unhelpful ruminations that we're all capable of falling into. And I found it very helpful to spend more time out in the garden and also raiding the deep freeze for my random stash of frozen fruit of all sorts, including a few medlars from those first trees, and mucking about with them in the kitchen. And then helpfully, my husband David and one of my daughters pointed out that I seemed to be taking myself in a different direction of interest and happiness and of growth, personal growth. And it seemed maybe that there was something new that I wanted to do. So one thing led to another. I decided that I would have a go at making a new kind of working life. I had previously been working in my own business as an executive leadership coach, following my career in the City of London in the equity markets. And I decided to have a go at it. Nobody else was specialising in the Medlar on a dedicated basis, so there was an opportunity. And not many people seemed to know what it was, so there was a chance to, introduce people to something that used to be part of our lives, but which we'd forgotten about. And then a survey was published in the UK that showed that whilst awareness was low, curiosity was quite high. And I thought, well, there's the opportunity. So one thing led to another. Eastgate Larder. I have a larder. I live in Eastgate. And then in 2020, along comes my successful application to have the orchard recognised as a national collection, my having planted a lot more trees with the help of David. And then at the beginning of last year, Catherine Kilgarriff of Prospect Books came back to me and said, I think the time is right for a book on the Medlar. And I swallowed hard and worked on that. And here we are.
Well, Jane, I was hoping that you might be able to read for us. It's a little paragraph. There's so much in the book. I thought which one would kind of like encapsulate a little bit of your process. And that is on page 16. Could you read that for us?
I can, with pleasure. And thank you so much, Ria, for inviting me to do this. A strategy was emerging. I needed to raise awareness of the fruit, encourage people to plant a tree, try the fruit or a Medlar preserve. I could see that this might appeal to some people. But what about beer drinkers, art lovers, gin fans? A medium-term plan to find collaborative ways to bring about a beer, a gin, and make some art was taking shape for later.
You're really collaborating with all these different kind of foodie heavens here, with the preserves and also with the libations. I have to say, I was a little sad that I didn't see cider in there. But
well, have you found that part of the book where I describe what happened when I did want there to be a cider? And I think looking back on it, it was a classic case of not knowing what I didn't know. And the advice I was given by the cider maker I was talking to was to make a Medlar flavoured syrup. This is how the Medlar syrup came into being. I made the Medlar syrup. We introduced it to some of his dry cider, and it made a very pleasant but undistinguished drink. But I got out of that experience the Medlar syrup, which is now so versatile and so useful, which I was describing earlier. But our conversation today and the learning last year from the Turkish recipes about using the astringent hard fruit, tannin rich, is piquing my curiosity for the future. I wonder whether there is going to be a Medlar cider.
I do want to make mention, you have Medlar cider on here. It's on page 163. And so you have a recipe here for folks to dig into, which is great.
Yes.
And the recipes are just delicious. I just need more Medlar to be able to try them all. Yeah, well, it's my pleasure to be talking to you for sure. I feel like I have my own talking palms on the podcast, and then to see a book on Medlars, just, we're screaming for delight in the cider house here. Absolutely. It's wonderful.
Ria, thank you so much and thank you for being part of the revival of the Medlar. Your advocacy and support and this invitation make a big difference. So thank you.
My pleasure, Jane. Make sure to follow Jane Steward on Instagram at Eastgate Larder. You'll find it there and all her upcoming events going on. She does do talks, so if that's something that your garden club or orchard or cidery might be interested in, you'll now know how to contact her. You'll have all that and more at ciderchat.com, the show notes for this here episode 383.
Walking through the orchards
I know without a doubt that all the Talking Palms listened to the very end of this conversation with Jane Steward.
Thank you, Jane.
I know that she feels the same way, Medlars. And if you out there in Ciderville enjoyed this episode and want to help support this podcast, which is listener supported, by the way, you can hit the donate button at ciderchat.com or become a patron at the Cider Chat Patreon page. There's multiple tiers, and it's up to you to decide what you can afford. Without a doubt, every little bit counts. And with that, I leave you here. This is Rhea Windcaller signing off for now. Looking forward to seeing you in Ciderville. We drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this. There is a reason why we drink it like this. There is a reason why we do it like this.
Yeehaw!